Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in. Hello, sir. Good to see you. Good to see you too. How are you doing?
Awesome. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about. I'd be happy to talk about Pakistan versus India, for example.
Yeah, that's super timely. Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Yeah, we can dive in.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so Sam, let's talk about Pakistan and India. We've briefly talked about India and their demographic challenges that are upcoming, but we haven't looked at this conflict before and just this region more broadly and how to think about it. And with everything that's happening now, I thought it'd be a good time to dig in. So why don't you set some context here?
Yes, well, there was an outbreak of fighting in India and Pakistan in the last few weeks, unsurprisingly, over some of the disputed regions. This is a well-known, many decades unresolved flashpoint between the two demographic giants. And it's something that goes back all the way to unresolved issues with basically the partition of the British Raj, right? Of like the Indian Raj of the subcontinent, where broadly speaking, there was a division between sort of the predominantly Muslim parts of the country and the predominantly Hindu parts of the country, breaking away, Pakistan, which, used to be West and East Pakistan. East Pakistan became, its own country, Bangladesh later on. And, there's an interesting dynamic here where India, in fact, continues to retain a large Muslim population. So, because we've spoken before on the demographics of India, one thing that I think I should point out to the listeners is that India would have, in a prolonged war with Pakistan, especially anything that had sort of religious undertones, just massive domestic stability problems. We're talking about a population of 200 to 300 million that might actually sympathize with Pakistan to a great degree. Not to mention then the possible entanglement with the politics of the Middle East, with possibly different countries there seeing an opportunity to revive the Islamist projects, which, by the way, do have some currencies in various parts of Pakistan. Pakistan is a country that, is as stitched together as in a way India is. You have radically different society in, say, Islamabad, along the Indus Valley River, in up in the mountains near Afghanistan. You basically have areas that are controlled by essentially the Taliban, or at least their closely affiliated political party, right? There's a ethnic diversity, right? There are groups country that are more affiliated with Iranic influences. There are groups that are, basically Pashtun. And, at the end of the day, Pakistan's state capacity has over the decades been relatively low, with one exception, the military. It is the military that keeps the country together. It is a relatively well-equipped military. So this is not an asymmetric fight in the classic sense of, oh, there's like an insurgent group like the Houthis or whatever, and they're, say, fighting the US Air Force or perhaps Saudi intervention or the Israeli Air Force or something. It's much more a relatively modern, though perhaps when I say modern, I should qualify, late 20th century doctrine style military facing another relatively modern, late 20th century doctrine military on the other side. Both countries, both Pakistan and India, have a decent amount of jet fighters, a lot of artillery. They're both nuclear armed countries. They actually have some fairly well trained special forces as well. And, of course, a vast reservoir of manpower. India and Pakistan are, you know, among the only countries today that could actually fight a war where lots and lots of lives could be expended without a deleterious demographic cost to the economic and cultural future of the country. So, in terms of pure manpower, both of these countries likely have the highest mobilizable reserve of fighting men that they could spare. Now, having said this, the natural escalation ladder here seems obvious. Had the fighting not stopped with a ceasefire, you would see more jet aircraft downed, and India did down a few Pakistani planes, and you would perhaps start to see more intense ground fighting, and at one point, some sort of territorial objective would be pursued, either like a pacification of a region in Pakistan, which India would probably invade on the thesis that, we have to we're not taking this territory immediately. We're just carrying out a special military operation of our own to, destroy the staging ground for terrorist groups in India. And in fact, this recent bout of fighting started on that rationale. And it doesn't help that there are legitimate ties to terrorist groups, both to the Pakistani military, to the Pakistani government, but also just groups that even oppose the central government. So it's very hard, even if Pakistan changes its policy in a variety of ways, they're not going to be able to assert control over all of these groups. So, from the Indian perspective, right, there's a real security consideration. There is potentially a pretext to go into territory and slowly resolve a long-standing territorial dispute in India's favor. So the main risk is basically an escalated, prolonged war, which fractures Indian society itself. Where I think this cannot be underestimated. A genuinely nationalist, anti-Islamist India would, perhaps overcome bureaucratic lethargy, as we discussed in previous episodes, but would also definitely face an internal civil war. And that then opens the can of worms that can potentially lead to a dissolution of India. And by dissolution, there would still be an absolutely massive country of over a billion people called India, but you might see new breakaway regions, or at least areas where there's unending insurgency and civil war. Perhaps a good analogy here could be the unending insurgency and diplomatic tension in the Kurdish regions of Turkey, where the Kurdish Workers' Party, sometimes supported by foreign support of foreign powers, sometimes domestically, could drive insurgency for a long time. And there might even be small peripheral parts of India that manage to break away with perhaps military support from China. One thing that has to be discussed is that, China has no real interest in the Middle East, arguably no real interest in Ukraine versus Russia either, except to have Russia perhaps not lose too badly nor win too well. But they do have an interest, a long-term interest in containing India. And economic ties with Pakistan have existed, but also some security ties. So it is not beyond the realms of possibility, given that China has its own territorial disputes, famously fought in the Himalayan mountains with clubs, spears, and phalanx formations, right? Where they have troops facing each other, but there's this kind of unofficial rule that no small arms fire is to be discharged. So they graduated from basically fist fights to knife fights. They're kind of reinventing, Bronze Age warfare with phalanx formations and so on, troops that are specially trained for melee. It's a very interesting political phenomena up there. But there's a genuine territorial dispute, there's a great power rivalry where India has the potential to match or exceed China, or at least China perceives that to be the case in the very long run. And there would be an opportunity for China to arm groups that they would favor, right? That would reduce India's territorial reach and pin down India's interest much more locally. So there's so much to talk about here. I know I already started weaving these threads, but you're gonna have to help me, Eric, and zoom in on the most interesting threads here because it is such a rich topic. And it is actually a very complicated political and military problem. We were, by the way, very lucky that no miscalculation happened that led to a nuclear war, and we can maybe even talk about what would an India versus Pakistan nuclear war look like? That can be one potential later topic in this episode.
Hey, everybody. Erik here with a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with Netsuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/102. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/102. netsuite.com/102.
Yeah. Well, at the highest level, where do you see things going from here? Like, what are sort of the possible paths forward, or and sort of if you had to predict kind of how things might play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will continue to be sporadic outbreaks of fighting. There will continue to be ceasefires because at the end of the day, I think India is at most trying to marginally reduce the risk of terrorist action within India. So really, I think in India's perspective, this is almost a policing action. In Pakistan's perspective, this is potentially an existential threat to the existence of Pakistan, right? Within India, Islamic terrorism and frictions with Islamist ideologies, but also just like, frictions with the desire to be a recognized minority with fully equal rights, et cetera, in practice. So there are some, at least in some parts of India, some provinces, legitimate grievances that the Muslim minority has there. There is a persistent need to nip any such development in the bud within India. And this seems to necessitate going across the India-Pakistan border. There's also, of course, a complete, you know, reluctance to give up any territorial claims that exist, right? Because, states tend to never abandon those, but also it would seem a political betrayal for a head of state to do so, even if they decided, what, actually Kashmir just doesn't matter. It's like such a tiny part of India. Sure, the water rights are important, but we can settle this somewhat or in some way. But anyone that did this would be domestically outflanked by the more nationalist forces in the country. And to say a little bit about the nationalist perspective in India, there is a desire to make India a true nation state. And there is a perspective that there is a demographic differential which over time within India favors the Muslim population over the Hindu population. So there is a concern among Indian nationalists that if a unitary national identity of some kind is not established, there might be future further partitions of India. Because from their perspective, we even say, the Indus River being mostly outside of India is an interesting development politically, right? So if you want something like a civilization state with the full historical range, I think that their perspective would be that, Pakistan should have been a part of India, right? So there's an irredentist perspective, there's a civilization scale perspective, and there's also again this geopolitical perspective where, you know, in a way, Pakistan does exist as an anti-India. Pakistan is very aware that its main security threat model is basically losing a war with Pakistan. That is like basically the only existential problem that Pakistan has in a geopolitical sense, other than mere fragmentation or incursion across the border from Afghanistan. But that could never extend its reach down the river to all the other cities and so on. That could simply not happen. There's no ability or capability to govern that vast a territory. So because of that, okay, India will be pushing to attack these groups. Pakistan will be unwilling and unable to prevent that, but will be obliged in order to protect the territorial integrity of their sovereign country, their statehood, their whole existence, their reason for being, right? Of the armed forces, which are the one institution that holds the country together, defense against India, that means they can't back down. So there'll be like these perpetual clashes, frictions. It is unresolvable until one side becomes much more powerful than the other, or something fundamental changes in the domestic politics of either India or Pakistan. So you would need to have like basically a regime change in one of the countries, and then maybe you have a peaceful resolution. But a regime change doesn't just mean, well, you put in a puppet government. It means that the whole basis of legitimacy of one or the other state would have to be remade. Like the origins of India and Pakistan are closely tied to these issues, right? The whole story of decolonialization is interpreted very differently in the two countries, right? And again, from the Hindu nationalist perspective, India is this great civilization ready to take its role in the world, but right here it has this like neighbor of Pakistan that is basically dedicated to being a thorn in India's side, pinning down state energy and attention close to home, preventing the country from projecting power outwards. And then from Pakistan's perspective, it's this country that has like immense potential, immense human capital potential, that has like a tricky balancing act between modernization and, honoring its own Islamic heritage. And yet it cannot really become a strong country other than, being constantly on the lookout for its much, much bigger neighbor. Like if you could put Pakistan in the middle of Africa or Latin America or Europe, it would be a huge, powerful country, even if it was a very poor country. But right next to India, it is perpetually a minor power, right? Even though it has a bigger population than Iran, right? We never think of Pakistan as having the geopolitical reach of Iran, even though, unlike Iran, it has nuclear weapons because it is overshadowed and pinned down by India as well. So, okay, you would need to change the story. Why does Pakistan exist? Well, it exists to protect, this Islamic heritage of this fragment of this, like, Mughal Indian civilization, et cetera, et cetera. There's some other national stories that have been told on top of this. Why does India exist? Okay, it's like, the heir of this other ancient civilization. Each of these societies has an incompatible story for their own legitimacy with the other. And because of that, I think the genuine geopolitical difference of interest is greatly exaggerated between the two. I do think the water rights are important, but this was a settled issue until the recent war, right? There was a treaty signed for the distribution of water usage between the two countries decades ago, and there's nothing unworkable about that distribution. Still, I think that the Pakistani military understands that it cannot win an offensive war against India. I think that fantasy was given up long ago because India just does have a much larger military force, something like a factor of 2 or 3. These are both, depending on what kind of material you count, right? You count aircraft, you count navy, what do you count? But even something basic as air force. Both countries also, if they fought a serious war, now this could happen. By default, I'm going to say it's not going to happen. I think this will just be a simmering conflict, basically occasionally escalated, occasionally de escalated. But it does have the possibility of escalating to a larger war I mean, if that happens, both sides will attempt to use airstrikes against the other, and both sides will successfully shoot down the other's aircraft. They've bought equipment from the United States, from China, from Russia, and they have, like high quality end of 20th century, early 21st century anti-air systems that can shoot down any planes. I think that in a serious war, you would first see a lot of troop deployments because they have these tools that are widely used, some artillery. The adoption of drone warfare would be much slower because the two sides have not developed their drone capabilities. It would probably take like a year or two of fighting for that to happen. There would be no rapid escalation to nuclear weapons unless, say, the Pakistan government was near collapse. And the reason for that is it will be believed that the war can be won with conventional means. So, in a way, the very abundant manpower is actually its own form of buffer, where the escalation to a nuclear war, I think that is only in the incentive of Pakistan if starts losing what it plausibly can make a stalemate. Because even though India is much larger and has much better equipment, very quickly in a war between the two countries, the air power would balance out because it would be just too expensive to have planes be destroyed flying over enemy territory. And then there would be a difficulty of concentrating India's larger military in the right theaters in such a way as to actually overwhelm Pakistan's military, if we're talking about infantry or even artillery. So it would be a slow grind, and then Pakistan could think it could find foreign sponsors and might even find foreign sponsors in the form of China. And I would only really be worried about a nuclear war happening between the two countries if it seems like, you know, if India extended the stated objectives of the war to be regime change in Islamabad, and if the front lines in such a hypothetical conflict, and it is hypothetical at this point, if they would start collapsing. In that case, Pakistan might be tempted to use its significant arsenal of nuclear weapons delivered by, mid-range missiles and, wage nuclear war on India, or at least threaten to. India and Pakistan are fairly evenly matched on their nuclear warheads. We're talking about 170 nuclear warheads for each, maybe 200, probably operational. And I think if it came to that sort of conflict, India has no interest in that. This would probably completely derail India's development since, I think even 100 nuclear strikes in India would result in a death toll of millions and internal refugee waves of tens of millions at least, maybe as much as 50 or 60 million. So if we saw a nuclear war between the two countries, I think that this would probably result also in one of the biggest international refugee crises, since I think something like 30 to 50 million people would just leave the subcontinent. These sound like fantastic numbers, right? 30 million people, that's, the population of Poland. 50 million people, that's basically the population of Italy or South Korea. But proportionally, it's a tiny, tiny percentage, right? India plus Pakistan, it's like 1.5 billion people, let's say roughly. And if 1% of the population left in the aftermath of a nuclear war, you know, that's already quite a bit, right? We're already talking about 15 million people. And I think 1% is, an unreasonably low estimate. So even if you don't reach the kind of percentages you saw in the Syrian civil war at like 30%, or the Russia-Ukraine war at like 10%, if 5% of Indians leave India, or let's say a more narrow region, the one around, in the whole war between India versus Pakistan, the effective regions of India are fairly small unless there's a nuclear war. If there's a nuclear war, the affected regions of India extend to all of India. So if 5% of Indians left in the aftermath of a nuclear war, we'd be talking about, we really would be talking about 75 million people. So when I say 30 to 50 million people leave, I'm actually assuming the vast majority of them will be an internal refugee problem, right? And in Pakistan and India. And between the two countries, because Pakistan has less state capacity, all else equal, would probably have like less capacity in the aftermath of a nuclear war, whatever it might be. I think about half, 50-50 would be the outflow. It would be about 25 million from Pakistan, 25 million from India. And where would they go? I mean, many of them would probably go to UAE and the Persian Gulf. Many would go to neighboring countries. People forget that, for example, in the Syrian civil war, Turkey absorbed millions of the Arab refugees. But at least, at least half of this huge refugee wave would disperse to Europe and to the Anglosphere as a whole because of the family ties of the diaspora. Like, people will be helping relatives get out, like, with good reason, right? And that would make it the central focus of the world. They wouldn't be, however, a nuclear cross contamination. So there would not be explosive expansion of the nuclear war unless the very unwise decision was made by India to extend the nuclear war towards China. But I think for that to happen, China would need to be overtly at war with India. It wouldn't be enough for China to hypothetically do something like, deliver artillery or missiles to Pakistan, right? So if China was as involved in an India-Pakistan war as the United States is in Ukraine, I do not believe India would attempt to nuke China, because at the end of the day, China also just has a much larger nuclear arsenal, and China is building up a nuclear arsenal where it aims to rival not Pakistan and India, which are about evenly matched, or France or Britain. It's aiming for a nuclear arsenal to match that of Russia and the United States. So there's just no strategic rationale to do that.
Yeah. The Can you compare and contrast this with sort of the Israel Palestine, or what can we learn from other conflicts, how they played out as it relates to this one?
I think for big differences, and there's some similarities. Part of the similarity is, of course, the awkward question, if you have this like zone with an unclear legal status, or, at best, a very hostile government where the terrorists are operating. And for your own domestic security, you have to go for that base of terrorist operations. I think that is a similarity that the two countries, the two situations share. A difference here is that Pakistan and India are vast countries, and the disputed territory is fairly small. Like, the actual territorial dispute between, India and Pakistan is like, it's relatively large. It is, the region of Kashmir, but we are talking about a country that's like, let's say it's the size of like Slovakia, or, Belgium, right? It's very densely populated. There are a lot of people there. However, this is tiny compared to the size of the two countries. It is strategically much more important to Pakistan than to India. India is not strategically crippled if it were to hypothetically lose all of its claims there, but Pakistan might be, right? It might become much more vulnerable to India and might need to become a client state of India, a situation that Pakistan wants to avoid. Pakistan nationalists have good reason to want to avoid that. So the difference here is that, in theory, the conflict can be resolved without an existential question for either side. However, in the Israel versus Palestine situation, both if you're a Palestine nationalist or Israeli nationalist, the maximalist claims of the opposing side are existential, right? What is the disputed territory in the Israel-Palestine conflict? Well, in the broadest scope, it is the entire territories of Israel and Palestine, right? Like, if you're, a committed Palestinian, you probably just want Israel to stop existing. You want it to go away. You think of it as a totally, a total colonizer effort, etc. And, again, probably the only way, and if, again, on the Israeli side, if you want to secure it, it's very hard to imagine a friendly government or a friendly society arising in a place like Gaza. So perhaps the easiest way would just be to, take that territory. and just make it part of Israel and maybe move the people somewhere else, right? So that's I think a difference. But there is a bit of a similarity in that what is at stake is the legitimacy of the two states. So it's not economically or politically as kind of an existential conundrum as for Palestine and Israel, but ideologically there is like a little bit of a comparison there again, because look, the Pakistani central government is incredibly delegitimized if it loses even a minor war to India, because the entire purpose of the Pakistani military is to defeat India. If they cannot do it, by what legitimacy do they hold the country together? They do not. Pakistan shatters. It shatters into like 5 or 6 other countries or different zones. Probably something like ISIS emerges. Probably various nationalist groups have uprising. Probably border regions, declare independence. Honestly, heck, Iran might intervene, right? If Pakistan shatters, Iran might intervene and like back Shia groups, right? Or at least back local governments that might be favorable to them, right? So Pakistan can't afford that. And from the Indian perspective, it's sort of like you are sitting on a demographic time bomb and you have this commitment to being a pluralistic democracy, but you're a very bureaucratic society while being very poor, and you have real security concerns. Like, how exactly are you going to develop this economy to one day fulfill your potential to be like a rival of China, let's say, or rival or a peer of the United States? The continent, the subcontinent has that potential. It could be a rival or peer of either the United States or China. Probably the weakest of the three because of various disadvantages that we can talk about if we maybe focus on the potential for Indian industrialization or something like that. But still, it is difficult to imagine that development being possible if you have simmering under the surface an almost Yugoslavia tier ethnic conflict, right? Within India, that is. So not even between India and Pakistan, but within India. I think if I were trying to pursue Indian strategy, my goal would simply be we will economically outgrow Pakistan. And not only will we economically outgrow Pakistan, we are going to like take internal security very seriously. And then you just kick the can down the road decade after decade, and eventually you end up being a much richer country next to a still relatively fractious neighbor. And actually, India letting Pakistan be is a fairly good deal, because if you kick down the government in Islamabad, you're not going to be able to occupy this territory. You're not going to be able to govern it. You're going to have 5 or 6 statelets, some of which are certainly going to be, supporting terrorist networks, right? So actually your security problems would multiply. So genuinely there is a policy option here where if India just hits snooze on the conflict, the military conflict, I think every single year from now on for the next 50 years, the pure military aspect of it goes more in India's favor, right? But then there is the question of are you are you want do you could imagine someone wants to have a big war with Pakistan to defeat Pakistan to discredit Islamism within India. But I don't think Islamism in India is yet a great political force. So I do think there's just this sort of like vague awkwardness where there is friction between, the classic Hindu, Buddhist sort of Indian religions and say the Abrahamic religions, in this particular case, the Islamic religion. So I think there's like a difficulty in ideologically reconciling these two strands of Indian history as truly Indian while Pakistan exists. Like you could imagine an alternate world where after independence, the British Raj is something like called the Indian Federation or something like this. And you'd have as part of the federation, say, Indian and Hindu states. And the Indian and Hindu states would just say that, oh, we're both legitimately Indian, but we come from like, the Islamic period of our history, and we We have been most affected by that part of our shared heritage. Still, such a federation would probably be perpetually internally divided just due to electoral politics. It would be like constantly split basically on ethnic grounds, right? And for better or worse, given how diverse India is, it's not that internally ethnically split. It has produced something of a shared political community. So at the end of the day, perhaps partition was geopolitically suboptimal, but not that suboptimal for running an Indian government.
Yeah, hindsight is 2020.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But again, counterfactuals are hard to figure out. But there would have been nothing good about, say, an India that was unified after independence and then had a nasty civil war in the 1970s with one side backed by the Soviet Union and one side backed by the US. That would have been a mess, right? That would have been a true mess and would have massively set back all those territories and all those peoples.
Fascinating. Why do you think when people get this conflict wrong or misunderstand it or underestimate certain elements of it, which parts do you think are not as totally appreciated?
I think what's not appreciated is the precariousness of the Pakistani side, where they must respond. Their state legitimacy rests on it, right? And what they don't understand is that if India wins, it does not yet have the capability to govern that territory. There's no exit strategy for India if it goes into Pakistan. Imagine all the challenges of Iraq, except you're not America, you're India, right? Like, okay, what is the victory scenario for India? The best victory scenario is that Islamabad is like shaken, has egg on their face, but somehow they continue to control the country after they lose all of those disputed territories. And they renounce claims, or at least let the claims lie and just don't do anything about it. And then maybe India and Pakistan have some sort of quiet agreement where they keep talking about this, let's say the Great War of 2026. They keep talking about it for the next 50 years, but the two governments know that neither government's going to do anything, and maybe the Indian government quietly supports Islamabad and occasionally gives them intelligence and money to deal with the various groups that are trying to overthrow Islamabad, just arguing quite straightforwardly that the Pakistani state has lost legitimacy because it lost a war to India. So that's like the best I can eke out as an Indian win. Now, what does a Pakistan win look like? I think a Pakistan win is India tries to invade, and the government, for the first time ever, in the course of fighting a war, engages in total mobilization of Pakistan society, right? Like a similar kind of thing that what was done in Ukraine. You build out a state, corruption suddenly becomes a problem because corruption in a case of war, corruption at a large enough scale when you're fighting a war is a form of treason, almost a form of collaboration and sabotage with the enemy. Suddenly, you would have state capacity in Pakistan go up rather than down. And if you manage to merely preserve the status quo from before the war, that is, repel a larger force from India, assert your sovereignty, mobilize your society, you know, in that case, India might find itself with a very powerful neighbor. Run this 20 years after, say, Pakistan wins such a war, it's a much stronger Pakistan than one that did not fight and win such a war, right? You would be talking about a country of 300 million people with a strong national identity, national pride, in the military that managed to defeat the stronger Indian force, proving the original thesis of the country as the protector of rights, possibly now feeling emboldened to declare itself the protector of Muslims in India and saying, oh, actually, India is trying to suppress our religion, our identity within India. And, we should be issuing ultimatums to India about their treatment of their Muslim population. That's an absolute disaster for India. So, I don't think India would allow Pakistan to win that war. But, I think that's what people are missing. An expansionist Indian war has no clear win condition. A defensive or mildly expansionist Pakistan war has a win condition, but it is such a gamble that it is stupid to embark on it. So I think the Indian side knows this. So they will try to not to put Islamabad with their back against the wall to fight such a war.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.